What is going on, everyone? I'm Cucumber, and today I want to talk about the Souls trilogy and their mechanics. This idea arose when I began thinking about how cool it would be to translate certain World of Warcraft raid bosses into a Souls format. It was then when I got onto thinking about other types of mechanics and changes I would enjoy seeing in future games. I have read many a forum post where people were upset over certain mechanics or systems in the Souls series. The gripes covered New Game Plus issues, boss repetitiveness, and everything else in between. Every one of these factors pushed me to put in my 2 cents and compile a collection of possible solutions or changes to mechanical problems and quirks within the Souls trilogy. Note, not all of my suggestions derive from MMOs, but many of them do draw from MMO influences. Okay, the first concept I want to discuss is scaling in New Game Plus. New Game Plus is a contentious topic in more ways than one, as From appears to go back and forth in terms of how it should be implemented. Dark Souls 3 has caught a lot of flack due to the quote-unquote ease of subsequent playthroughs. Dark Souls 1 is very similar in format to Dark Souls 3, as it simply raises the stats of every enemy and boss by a certain amount every consecutive cycle. Dark Souls 2, however, rattled that system significantly, as not only did it make the game more difficult numerically, New Game Plus also included changes in enemy placements, increased the number of more powerful red enemies, new items were added, and most notably in my opinion, From made slight adjustments to boss mechanics. Going from the Dark Souls 2 system back to the minimalistic system both Dark Souls 1 and 3 shared, definitely would usher irritation from the player base, and for good reason. Putting all that aside, the major issue I have seen brought up concerning Dark Souls 3 and this New Game Plus is the fact that it feels too easy. To address this supposed ease, I thought it would be interesting to change the scaling of each new game cycle. The way scaling currently works, based on the wiki, is that after beating the game for the first time, thus going into your first New Game Plus, the stats of the enemies jumps inconsistently throughout. The discrepancies vary depending on the location, but the changes in stats range from a 150 to 250% increase, going from your initial new game into New Game Plus. This is the most daunting change in difficulty, as afterward, the increases to enemy stats drops significantly per playthrough, only increasing by another 25% at the highest difficulty. Therefore, if these numbers were to remain true in future games, I would not change the overall increase, rather, make the jumps in scaling per playthrough more significant. This would be done by making the New Game Plus numbers the base difficulty numerically, and have every cycle thereafter increase by 12.5%, up to the 25% max. As a result, by the player's third run, he has reached the highest difficulty. So try to imagine the game being separated into 3 major difficulties. These changes may appear dramatic at first, as it essentially starts the game on New Game Plus, then leaps straight into New Game Plus 3 or 4, and then finally plunging into New Game Plus 7. However, based on how power is gained in Dark Souls, the player usually reaches maximum strength by the end of New Game, or maybe New Game Plus, if it is a hefty build. When you boil it all down, the amount of power still attainable by the end of the first 1 or 2 playthroughs, as it is now, is negligible. Starting the game with New Game Plus values and jumping 12.5% with each cycle would, in my eyes, be significant enough to provide a challenge that more closely emulates that of the first playthrough. Also remember, the maximum would remain a 25% increase of the New Game Plus numbers, so it would not be any more difficult than the current NG Plus 7, or 6. What I've seen on the wiki says that the common confusion lies in how the number of pluses is 1 less than the number of playthroughs or something like that, but we do not need to go any further than that. Anyway, having a sharper exponential increase in scaling would be the first change I would make. Secondly, I want to talk about bosses, especially how they change in New Game Plus. In Dark Souls 2, as I said before, From altered mechanics on bosses depending on which New Game cycle one was playing. However, the changes were, at times, too minor to notice, or they simply inserted additional mobs in the fight. The latter, I found, was kind of stupid. Regardless, From did change the bosses, which deserves commendations. I would do the same, but I would go one step further with more considerable adjustments. My thoughts on how bosses should change per New Game cycle is definitely a give and take, which you will notice when I give examples. I know of many people who claim Dark Souls 3 is the easiest game already, but I would actually make the initial new game mechanically easier so the fight in later cycles can be made more difficult, thus solidifying the stance I took with New Game Plus scaling changes to facilitate 3 difficulties, not only numerically, but mechanically as well. To explain more thoroughly, I will give 2 bosses as examples to show possible changes that could be made to their mechanics per New Game cycle up to the new highest difficulty of New Game Plus 2. The first example will be Soul of Cinder. The Soul of Cinder, as he is now, has 2 phases. The first involves the boss randomly switching his tactics and abilities between 4 player skill sets. After depleting his health, the boss enters his second phase, which causes him to utilize Gwyn's moveset from Dark Souls 1. The way I would change the encounter in New Game would be to take away his Gwyn transformation. The first phase would solely consist of his sword moveset, and in the second phase, he would then begin switching between player movesets. In New Game Plus, the fight would flip. The first phase is similar to what it is originally, the boss switching between player patterns, and in the second phase, he would actually revert to his base sword abilities. However, it is not that simple. The boss may be crippled by using his basic moves, but his handicap includes a newfound ability, Lightning Miracles. A simple change, but it is noticeably different to the player's first encounter. In New Game Plus 2, the new highest difficulty, the Soul of Cinder now becomes the fight we all saw in Dark Souls 3 originally. He initially switches between player attack patterns until the player depletes his health, thus revealing the Gwyn mechanics and Lightning Miracles in the second phase. In other words, you fight what is now New Game Plus 7 Soul of Cinder. That may sound uninspired, but think about it this way. For the first 2 cycles, all the player is given is the first phase, with Lightning Miracles thrown in for good measure. It is not until the highest difficulty, when everything climaxes, as players are given the opportunity to fight the Soul of Cinder at full strength, as he was meant to be. If that does not convince you, let me quickly give you my second example, Pawn of Sullivan. Pawn of Sullivan is a fast-paced, dual sword-wielding behemoth that has combos for days. He is also a 2-phase fight, like many in Dark Souls 3, in which he grows wings and summons a transparent clone of himself that premeditates his attacks a second or so before the actual boss executes them himself. The clone concept is made even more fun, as he can also hurt the player just as much as the original boss. At the same time, Pawn of Sullivan has a fatal flaw. He is parryable. If a player dedicates himself to learning Sullivan's timings, the Pontiff can be made trivial through this quirk in boss design. So how would I change it? The first time you encounter Sullivan in my iteration of New Game, he remains largely unaltered, except for how he no longer has a second phase. Everything else about him is the same. He just does not grow wings or summon a clone. Therefore, he is not too hard after you get the parry timings down. The second fight in New Game Plus has 2 major changes. Firstly, the second phase of the fight is introduced, as he now summons his clone. The next change is quite interesting in my eyes. Previously, Sullivan was parryable, and you were able to punish him with major riposte damage. In New Game Plus, Pontiff remains parryable, but players are unable to riposte him. That is not all. Because of that change, Sullivan's recovery time after being parried is quicker, so players cannot wail on him while he's suspended in limbo. Parries now act more along the lines of an effective block rather than a counterattack. Lastly, when you fight Pontiff in New Game Plus 2, both the second phase and the parry rules change once again. Concerning the second phase, Pontiff's clone was previously killable. It may not mean much to some, but to everyone else, our best purple friend is now invincible. But you can still see him, so don't worry about that. Therefore, the moment Pontiff summons that little bundle of joy, he is in for the rest of the fight. Now, to address the parry rules. In the first 2 cycles, you can parry Pontiff. In New Game Plus 2, we cannot rely on impeccable timings anymore, as Sullivan is now immune to parries. Putting all the changes into consideration, I think the difficulty increase between the 3 cycles is notable, but still fair. I hope these examples showcase that even minor differences can dramatically alter the landscape of each boss battle over the various New Game cycles. I know not every boss has as many mechanics or quirks to work with as Pontiff or Cinder, but my point still stands. Okay, I've probably talked this topic to death by now, so let's move on to dungeons and their multiplayer potential. This topic is probably the most MMO-esque system that I believe would be interesting to add into future Souls-like games. I know the Souls trilogy is, for the most part, a single-player experience, excluding the PvP aspect of the games. On the other hand, It appears to me with the removal of many co-op restrictions in Dark Souls 3, namely the soul level memory requirements, at least when using passwords, From wanted to facilitate co-op by making the process that much easier to connect with friends. On that note, why not go one step further by making something like chalice dungeons that are designed around multiple people being involved in the encounters? Having co-op centered content would allow From to branch out and develop a wider array of bosses and situations that would normally be unreasonable in a single player setting. Concepts such as puzzles, traps, and placing multiple, if not hordes of enemies at several players would be easier to manage and possibly more interesting because there are only so many variations of traps, puzzles, or enemies that are hard yet fair in a single player experience. The concept of wider variety reaches over to the bosses as well. When you think about boss design in the Dark Souls series, many, if not most of the bosses, appear to have the same strategies because they are, for the lack of a better term, reskins of one another. Think about the bosses in both Dark Souls 2 and 3. Dark Souls 2 bosses require the player to hit once, maybe twice, then dodge and circle strafe until you can attack again. Rinse and repeat. Dark Souls 3 is possibly worse as it's literally R1 and roll spamming. This is where multiplayer bosses can come into play. Imagine encounters with mechanics such as mind control, where a random player now attacks the group against his will and the party needs to damage him, or perhaps the boss, because this is still Dark Souls, enough to break the effect. Or maybe the boss does a massive, unavoidable blast of damage, and the group needs to stack next to each other to negate all of the damage. Another example could be that if there are multiple bosses, like Ornstein and Smough, they would need to be separated from one another, or they get a damage buff. It is mechanics like these that are totally unheard of in the Dark Souls boss repertoire, because they would be completely unfair in a single-player arena. Multiplayer environments could push for and validate mechanics such as those that I mentioned, and many more, thus allowing bosses to be more than just punching bags or roll simulators. These dungeons, of course, would be optional just like the chalices, and I think having bosses that require at least 2 people would be a compelling route to take for future boss design. All in all, I think having a more profound co-op scene beyond that of random summon signs would be a welcome addition to the Souls-like games. Now, I have one more set of ideas that I think would be awesome to implement in the Souls games, and they would involve one of the best additions to Dark Souls 2. Bonfire aesthetics. In Dark Souls 2, players are able to use bonfire aesthetics to reset any given area and/or boss. If I happen to really like the Fume Knight, for example, after defeating him, I could use an aesthetic to revive him and fight him again. The catch to using the aesthetic lies in how it also permanently increases the boss's difficulty by 1 new game cycle for every aesthetic used. While the idea is fantastic as it allows players to do bosses without having to traverse the entire game again, I still thought there was room for improvements. The first thing I would change about the aesthetics is to make them permanent and reusable rather than a limited consumable item. The aesthetic being a key item completely changes how the system would work. Instead of burning individual aesthetics, to revive a defeated boss, the player would need to use the boss soul acquired after winning the battle in the aesthetic. Taking my New Game Plus scaling into account, I would also not make it to where reviving the boss also increases the area's New Game cycle. If you revive the New Game version of a boss with the aesthetic, you will fight the New Game iteration again. At face value, that system seems pretty broken and provides an easy way to farm souls. I noticed this, and for that reason, I decided revoking rewards from a revived boss would be the best option, bar receiving the boss soul. Overall, you are able to fight and kill a boss repeatedly on 1 difficulty. However, you only get the regular soul rewards for the initial kill. Afterward, you are only given the boss soul so you can kill the boss again if you wished. Further rewards are only ever offered in the next New Game cycle with another boss soul and more regular souls. This system is really only for those who do not want to go into further New Game cycles, but it comes at the cost of essentially being unable to meaningfully progress or receive rewards. I also thought it would be cool to allow players to completely reset the game or individual DLCs without going into New Game Plus using the bonfire aesthetic as well. I imagine the final boss of each segment of the game, them being the Soul of Cinder, Sister Frieda, and Gale, dropping their ashes along with their souls. This item, if used, would reset the entirety of their part of the game. So if someone wanted to do the Ring City over again, he would burn Gale's ashes and all the bosses and areas would reset, bar the items that littered the landscape. That way, if someone were to decide he wanted to redeem his boss souls for weapons, he still had a way to stay on that new game cycle without the boss souls. However, once again, there is a price to taking this option. Very much like reviving individual bosses, if one uses the ashes of any of the 3 end bosses to reset their segment of the game, the now revived bosses neither drop boss souls or regular souls as rewards. So if you happen to redeem, let's say, Pawn of Soul, the only ways you can find him again are through burning the ashes or New Game Plus. Remember, the only way to receive additional boss souls, mass soul rewards, and an increased challenge is to go into New Game Plus. Until New Game Plus 2, the bonfire aesthetic is really only good for the purposes of fun, rather than possible progression. At that, I had originally thought the discussion would end there. But then I got to thinking about those who go into and pass the hardest difficulty. What point would there be to the aesthetic in New Game Plus 2 and beyond? This is where empowerment comes into play. At the beginning of New Game Plus 2, the Firekeeper would notice your aesthetic was glowing and on the verge of unleashing dormant power. After beating New Game Plus 2 and moving on to New Game Plus 3, the aesthetic would now be denoted as Bonfire Aesthetic Plus. With the newly empowered aesthetic, players would now be able to use their accumulated boss souls, if not redeemed, to empower the bosses. This new aesthetic acts more similarly to the Dark Souls 2 iteration, as it increases the challenge, but I would change it just slightly to make it where the empowerment only affects that specific playthrough. To actually empower the boss before the player begins the encounter, and this could be done at any time, the player would need to kindle the aesthetic using the boss soul acquired from a previous playthrough. If you remember my scaling of the New Game Plus values, New Game Plus 2 is the highest by increasing the health and damage of every enemy and boss by 25% from the new game values. Let me share some math with you guys so we can all be on the same page, and so that I can make sure I'm not getting anything mixed up. With my scaling system, if a boss has 100 health in New Game, he will have 112.5 in New Game Plus, and finally, in New Game Plus 2, he will have 125 health. The way the empowerment system works is that the boss's health and damage would increase by another 25%. Now the boss has 150 health when empowered once. Yes, I said once on purpose. We will go into that in a bit. If the player defeats the boss after empowering him, the player would receive 2 boss souls, along with an increased regular soul reward. The player would be rewarded with a regular boss soul for killing the boss, and an empowered version of the boss soul from the aesthetic. Think of it like a boss soul plus. These empowered boss souls could reward even more regular souls when used, or even possibly allow players to transpose them into boss armor instead of buying it, or maybe recolored versions of the boss weapons, who knows. At the same time, if the challenge is too difficult, the player always has the option to remove the empowerment. But the soul used to empower the boss is now lost, and the player would only receive the single base boss soul from winning the fight. Now, I would like to establish a few rules concerning empowerment and reviving the boss using the aesthetic. If a player happens to defeat a boss without empowering it, he can revive the boss to fight it in its empowered state. If the player has a second soul to empower the boss with, that is. Defeating the boss then rewards the player with an empowered soul and a base soul for winning the fight, just like normal. On the other hand, the revived boss still has the same rules from before. He does not drop additional regular souls, only his boss souls. Not only that, if a player decided he wanted to revive an empowered boss, an empowered soul acts just the same as a base soul. Put it into the aesthetic and it will revive the empowered version of the boss. Now this begs the question, what if I revive an empowered boss and use my brand new base boss soul to empower him a second time? This question leads us to what I mentioned earlier, saying that after empowering the boss once, he would receive a 25% increase to his stats. I would, in fact, implement multiple empowerments, but they are restricted by the New Game Plus cycle one is currently playing. To unlock the first empowerment, the player must be on New Game Plus 3, and to unlock the second empowerment, the player would need to be on New Game Plus 4. This trend continues once more into New Game Plus 5, adding up to an overall increase of 100% to the boss's health and damage. This 100% of course is based on the initial New Game values. Here's a table and some more math showing the stat increases I would implement with the empowerment system. It is also important for me to point out that after several New Game Plus cycles, players are able to choose what level of empowerment to enhance the boss by. So if your aesthetic is at max power, you can choose to empower the boss once, twice, or thrice. The best part about all that is how you only need the base boss soul to empower it to any level. The player does not need an empowered soul to empower further. It is all based on what level your aesthetic is. Finally, empowerment, if I did not mention it before, is completely optional. The bonfire aesthetic, in general, is not meant to be burdensome or required in any way. Just another means to have fun or instill more of a challenge in the game. Alrighty, that does it for me today. I've gone over a plethora of changes, mechanics, and systems that I would like to see in future Souls or Souls-like games. What are some of your suggestions? Other than that, if you have any questions, quarrels, or queries, be sure to let me know. I'm Cucumber, and remember, pass the dressing.